Today, I'm going to cover 3 stories that all became hugely famous as fiction. However, what most people don't know is they're actually based on real-life events. And these real stories are wild. And those are what I'm sharing with you today. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace their dish soap with cooking oil. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One night in May of 1896, a young opera singer sat inside of her dressing room at the Palais Garnier, which is this huge, beautiful theater in Paris, France. A little while earlier, she'd finished a performance of a very famous opera, and now she was getting changed and taking off her makeup. However, as she was doing this, she suddenly heard this sound in the theater that immediately sent goosebumps up and down her body. It sounded like a man was singing somewhere out there. And his voice was very deep and very sad. And really, it wasn't so much the sound of the voice that was so unsettling. It was just the fact that she was hearing anybody in the theater at all. I mean, she should have been alone in the theater. As far as she knew, all of the other performers and crew members had already gone home. So who was this? And so she left her room and she stepped out into the hallway and just began looking around, thinking maybe one of the other opera singers had maybe stayed behind without her knowing. But she didn't see anybody else backstage. And as she listened carefully to, again, this man who was still singing somewhere in the theater, she realized that the voice was actually coming from below her. And this revelation made her go from just being unsettled to being genuinely scared. So before she had ever worked in this theater, she'd actually heard a rumor about this theater. It was said that for the past several years, a man had been secretly living inside of this theater. And apparently, this same man had been horribly injured in a fire at a different theater that was nearby. And now he was, too scared to show his face in public. So he squatted in the basement and the walls of the Palais Garnier and only ever came out at night when he believed he was alone. Now, this woman, this young opera singer, had always assumed that, this was just obviously some legend made up to scare people or maybe even to entice people to come to this theater. But now, standing in the hallway and clearly hearing this strange, sad voice echoing up from beneath her feet, she really couldn't help but feel like maybe this story is true, and how terrifying a thought that was. However, as she stood there listening to this voice, she sort of slowly began to convince herself that maybe it actually wasn't a man's voice. Maybe this was the sound of water moving through the pipes or something like that. I mean, to be honest, the sound was sort of far away. And she's thinking, maybe I'm convincing myself this is an actual person's voice. Maybe it's not. And so she's sitting there listening, and sure enough, after a couple of minutes, she really had convinced herself that, no, this is not a person. This is just like late night sounds the theater makes, and I'm not really here a lot by myself, and I've never heard this before, so this is nothing. And so she quickly, because she told herself she was convinced of this, but deep down she wasn't, but she quickly went back into her dressing room, she gathered up her things, and she left for the night. A few days later, on the evening of May 20th, that same young opera singer was waiting in the wings just off stage. She and the rest of the cast were in the middle of a performance, and she was waiting for her cue to go on stage. But as she was watching the show from backstage, she suddenly saw movement above the stage, way up in the rafters. And she looked up and she saw there was a man in dark clothes who was up there. Now, at first, she thought, maybe this man is a stagehand. But as she continued to look at him, she realized he wasn't doing anything. He was just crouched up there, sort of hiding from everybody else, just sort of staring down at the performance, like he was watching the performance. But then, as this young opera singer is staring up at this guy, he suddenly turned and looked right at her. And this young singer, she had to hold back a gasp because this man's face was obviously just totally disfigured by what appeared to be burn scars. And so terrified, this woman turns, she rushes and grabs a crew member, and she points up into the rafters and says there's somebody up there. But when they both looked up again, the man in dark clothes with the burned face was gone. Now, the young singer, she felt certain that what she had seen just moments before was real. But the crew member was looking at her like, are you sure you saw that? Like, this seems pretty far-fetched. Like, why would anyone be up there? Certainly not some random person. Like, what are you talking about? And so she didn't know what to do, but the show she was in had to go on. About an hour later, the young singer was standing on stage and bowing in front of a crowd of nearly 2,000 people. She and the rest of the cast had just finished performing Act 1, and the young singer had barely made it through the performance because she was still so shaken up by what she had seen backstage, up in the rafters. All she wanted to do was get off stage and spend intermission calming down. But now, even though it was only the end of Act 1, the crowd was so excited and they loved the performance. She had just done so much. They were calling for her, specifically her, to do an encore of her last aria. The singer knew she didn't really have a choice. So she nodded to the conductor and then reluctantly stepped forward and restarted the piece. And as she sang, her anxiety actually began to melt away. She let herself get lost in the music, she closed her eyes, and she belted a high note. But suddenly, she heard this ear-splitting bang. And she opened her eyes just in time to see a brief flash of light. Then she watched in horror as the giant glass chandelier that hung above the audience came crashing down and landed directly on top of a woman, killing her instantly. Police immediately launched an investigation into the falling chandelier, but quickly determined that the whole thing was really just a freak accident. They said that one of the chandelier's candles had caused a small fire, which had melted the cord that held it up and caused it to fall. But the young singer, she didn't believe this, because she'd seen that burned man in the rafters just, less than an hour before the disaster, and she couldn't help but feel like he was to blame. And her theory, as wild as it sounded, actually gained traction. Eventually, a journalist named Gaston Leroux heard about it and started his own investigation. He spent weeks searching for the burned man, even showing up unannounced at the theater at different times of day and night to try to catch him. But he never did. However, Gaston did track down some construction workers who had helped build the theater 20 years earlier, and they claimed they knew exactly who the burned man was. So before the Palais Garnier was built, there had been another theater right down the block. But that theater had been completely destroyed by a fire 20 years earlier in 1873. On the night of that fire, a young pianist named Ernest had been inside the building, working on a wedding march for his fiancée, who was a ballerina at the theater. Out of nowhere, he began to smell smoke, and then before he knew it, flames blocked his only way out. He had no choice but to run through the flames. And by doing that, he suffered terrible facial injuries, but he would survive. Unfortunately, though, his fiancée did not make it out. She died in the fire. The construction workers told Gaston that after this horrible tragedy, Ernest had sort of removed himself from society. Like, not only did the burns make it difficult for him to be in public, he was, self-conscious, but also he was racked with grief about losing his fiancée. And so they said Ernest had taken refuge in the basement of the Palais Garnier, which at this point was just under construction. And the construction workers said they heard Ernest playing the piano at all hours in this basement, obsessively trying to finish that wedding march for his fiancée. And often while he was doing this, he was screaming and crying out in agony. Now, the workers told Gaston that eventually they stopped hearing Ernest, and they assumed at that point he had left, or maybe even died. Or they said, it's possible they never heard him at all, and they had convinced themselves that they were hearing him down there. They didn't know. But then, after that, performers at the now finished Palais Garnier reported hearing this sad voice singing after hours in the building. And some even reported seeing a scarred man, the scars on his face, creeping around the dark corners of the theater. But when these people would periodically investigate to see where it was coming from and who is that, nobody was ever there. And so after hearing this story from these construction workers, Gaston Leroux, the journalist, was, sort of conflicted in a way. On the one hand, he was sort of disturbed by, these two tragedies separated by 20 years. You have the fire that claimed the life of Ernest's fiancée and, apparently badly hurt Ernest. And then you have this chandelier falling and killing a guest at the theater at the Palais Garnier 20 years later. So that was horrible. That was tragic. But more than that, the feeling that Gaston had was that he felt sort of deeply moved by the story of Ernest's love for his fiancée. Whether or not the story was even true, whether or not he really did go into the basement as construction was being done and, try to finish that song for his dead fiancée. It didn't really matter. It was like that combined with these rumors of there being, this ghost in the theater. It was just kind of moving. The idea that, poor Ernest and his fiancée, that's what stuck out to the journalist. And so ultimately, Gaston ended up writing a book about this story, and the book was then adapted into one of the most famous musicals of all time. Today, Ernest is more often known by the nickname that Gaston Leroux gave him, the Phantom of the Opera. On September 29, 1939, a British intelligence agent walked through the door of the Royal Navy headquarters in London with an envelope tucked under his arm. When he stepped inside, a doorman stopped him and asked to see his pass. The agent flashed a badge that identified himself by the codename 17F, and the doorman simply nodded and let him through. Agent 17F then continued farther into the building, and he went down this long, silent white hallway to a black door with the number 39 painted on it. After looking around to make sure nobody was watching him, he reached down and he turned the handle and pushed the door open. And right away, he was hit by this brightly lit office, and inside it was absolutely chaotic. The air was full of smoke from tobacco, telephones were ringing off the hook, typewriters were clattering away, and men in dark suits were rushing back and forth. This was the office of Great Britain's Director of Naval Intelligence, and World War II had just broken out just a few weeks ago, so everything was nuts. The spies that worked in this office were literally out gathering intel and analyzing data and also coming up with creative, sort of crazy ways to literally trick the enemy. Now, Agent 17F was not actually an intelligence agent. He was the director's personal assistant, so he had no spy training. But he was very creative and had a way of coming up with schemes that were so crazy they just might work. And that really was a skill the department desperately needed right now. The director was really practical and analytical and pragmatic, and so he sort of liked having someone around in his personal assistant, 17F, whose thought patterns were just much more colorful. I mean, he really thought differently than the director. So Agent 17F very casually walked into this chaotic room and he strolled across the floor and he reached the director's door and he knocked. And a moment later, the director called for him to come in, and 17F walked inside, walked right over to the desk where the director was sitting, and he dropped that envelope he was carrying right on the desk. And the director picked it up, he opened the envelope, and started reading what was inside. And as the director's eyes scanned the page, Agent 17F couldn't help but see what looked like an annoyed look come across the director's face. So inside the envelope was a list of ideas that 17F had come up with for spreading misinformation to the Germans. Basically, they were ways to confuse and misdirect the German military by giving them fake information about what the British were up to. Now, this is a very normal thing that virtually every military does during a time of war. But these specific strategies that Agent 17F had come up with on this list were really out there. I mean, even for his own standards, these were sort of wild. For example, on this list, there was included this idea to have the British drop soccer balls covered in reflective paint into the ocean so that enemy submarines would, mistake them for explosives. There was another suggestion to put fake intelligence messages into literal bottles and just set them loose at sea and hope Germans found them. 17F also said he wanted to mail out fake copies of the Times newspaper with made-up news stories and made-up headlines to, again, sort of trick their enemy. And so Agent 17F had been pretty excited to share this list with the director. I mean, he was proud of these ideas. But now, looking at the director, it seemed like he was just getting really frustrated. And so 17F wondered if maybe he had pushed it too far. But just then, the director stopped and clearly was fixated on one particular idea on this list. And he looked up at 17F and he said, actually, this one seems workable. So the idea that the director liked was actually based on something that happened in a crime novel that Agent 17F had read. Agent 17F was suggesting that they borrow a corpse from the naval hospital, dress it in a British pilot's uniform, and put fake dispatches in its pockets with details of a supposed military operation. They then put a faulty parachute on the corpse's back and fly over the German coast and drop the corpse out onto the beach. And when the Germans found the corpse, the idea was that they would obviously assumed that this was an actual pilot who had died when his parachute failed. And then if they believed that, well, they'd very likely believe that the information the British agents planted in the corpse's pockets were actual military secrets that they'd intercepted. And so in the end, the director told Agent 17F that, you know what, this is actually pretty good. You did a good job after all. And so by the time Agent 17F left the director's office and walked over to his own desk in the corner, he was feeling proud that at least one of his big swings had potentially landed. 4 years later, at a pivotal moment in World War II, the British put a version of 17F's plan into action. They called it Operation Mincemeat, and amazingly, it worked. British spies did plant a corpse out on the beach with the faulty parachute with documents in its pockets saying that the Allied powers of America and Britain were going to invade Greece and Sardinia, which prompted the Germans to move a ton of their troops away from the Allies' real target, which was the island of Sicily. Sicily is part of Italy, and Italy was allied with Germany during World War II. And so thanks in part to Operation Mincemeat, 17F's big idea, the Germans were totally caught off guard by the invasion of Sicily, and the Allies captured the entire island. This then paved the way for an invasion of mainland Italy, which was a major turning point in the war. And again, it was all because of this one idea inspired by Agent 17F. Now, to be clear, Agent 17F was not personally there for the invasion, and he didn't publicly get credit for his role in planning it, even though Operation Mincemeat would become pretty famous. But anonymity was super important for anyone working in intelligence, which 17F was. And when the war ended, 17F might have stayed a ghost forever. But one slow afternoon at the end of the war, when the chaos in Room 39 had died down and there were only a couple dozen people still working out of that office, Agent 17F was sitting at his desk in the corner, and the other agents nearby were talking to each other about what they were going to do next. And Agent 17F, even though he wasn't a part of their conversation, internally he sort of asked himself the same question, like, what am I going to do next? I mean, he was so good at coming up with these wild ideas, and he really had so much fun doing it. Like, how could he just stop doing that and go have a normal job? Like, this was his calling. Doing what he did now is the only thing he wanted to do. But then he realized as he was sitting there that maybe he didn't have to stop doing this. After the war, for years, Agent 17F kept on coming up with fantastical spy ideas. But this time, instead of giving these ideas to the government, he wrote them all down with the intention of someday making a book around these ideas. And finally, in 1953, he published the first book under his real name, Ian Fleming. And his book was wildly successful, and he went on to write more books all about this same character who was a spy. And that spy's name was James Bond. One fall afternoon in 1830, a beaver trapper named Smith and his hunting partner, whose name was Bauman, hiked through the Bitterroot Mountains, which is a section of the Rocky Mountains in southwestern Montana. Now, where they were headed was this remote pond deep in the woods that was rumored to be full of beavers. However, despite that, nobody really ever dared to go there, because the area was also said to be cursed. Now, the reasoning behind, this rumor, the cursed rumor, is that about a year ago, a hunter had traveled to the pond on his own and he'd never come back home. And eventually miners had passed through that area and they found his body, and his body had basically been torn to shreds and actually partially eaten. And so naturally, rumors had begun to spread that, this pond was home to some kind of man-eating monster. But Smith and Bauman, they didn't believe in curses or monsters. They believed in money, and they knew that they'd make a lot of money from all the beavers they would catch at this pond. And so after several hours of hiking through the forest, Smith and Bauman did finally arrive at this cursed pond, and they hurried to set up their camp. They gathered firewood and they built a lean-to where they would stay for the next few nights. And then after that, they set up a few beaver traps around the pond and then followed this nearby stream several miles uphill and set up beaver traps along the way. And so when they were done setting all these traps, it was around sunset, Smith and Bauman decided to head back to their camp, the lean-to they had set up, and make some dinner and then go to bed. And so down the hill they went, and they're getting closer and closer to their campsite. And keep in mind, there's nobody else out here. They are in the middle of the forest. And as they're approaching their campsite, when they got within range and could actually see it, they just stopped. Because their lean-to they had put together as soon as they got there, their lean-to and all their gear had basically been torn to shreds. It's like their campsite had a tornado come through it, and everything was just kind of all over the place. And there was no people, no animals, no nothing. It was like something had happened while they were up the hill setting up these traps. Now, Smith and Bauman, their reaction was not, oh my goodness, like a monster came through here. They're like, great, a bear must have come through, because bears were in this area. So this is like a nuisance at this point. This is not confirmation that the pond is haunted and that there's a monster here. They're just like, great, we got to reset up our camp now. So the two men walked over to their destroyed campsite and began rebuilding it. But as they were, putting their lean-to back together and, packaging up their gear back into their bags, something really stood out that was pretty odd. So they're thinking that a bear must have come through here. And why would a bear come through here? Why would a bear tear all this stuff apart? Well, because the bear would be looking for food, as bears are known to do. But as they're packaging things up, both Smith and Bauman are seeing that none of their food was taken. Like, no food has been taken, and quite a bit of it was out in the open. So there certainly was opportunity, but it wasn't. And so they're thinking, that's so weird. Like, clearly a big effort was made to look through the campsite for something. It wasn't like an animal came over and just batted it around and then left. There had to be a reason. Like, what were they looking for? Like, what's going on here? That's so odd. But both men figured that what likely had happened here was, as they were coming back down the hill, this bear must have heard them and ran off before taking their food. And so ultimately they felt like they had just gotten really lucky here. And so Bauman went to go start a campfire to make their dinner, and Smith finished putting back together their lean-to camp. But just a little while later, as Smith reconstructed their lean-to, he couldn't shake the feeling that there really was something odd about whatever had happened here. They had this explanation that maybe they got lucky, but it just felt sort of weird, especially considering that there was lots of lore about this place being kind of dangerous to people. Forget whether it's a curse or a monster. There was just a fear that something odd was going on here. And so Smith, he said to Bauman, hey, I'm just gonna, for my own sanity here, look around and just look for tracks. Let's confirm that this really was a bear. And so, Bauman's like, great, go for it. He's, setting up the fire. And Smith, began walking away from the campsite looking for tracks. However, after stepping just a few feet away from, the campfire and their campsite, Smith realized it was just too dark out to actually see anything on the ground. So he went back to the campsite, he grabbed a torch, and he lit it in the fire that Bauman had made. And then now, with this light source, he left the campsite and began scanning the ground, looking for, the tracks from this bear. And at first, he didn't see anything. There were no tracks. It was just, some broken leaves and, There were some broken sticks and some, brush that had been sort of trampled over that suggested an animal had come through here, but again, there were no tracks. And so he's walking farther and farther away from their campsite until he gets to this clearing that was actually not very far from their campsite. But in this clearing, he found some tracks. There were these massive paw prints that were in the ground, tracks from this animal with huge claws, like massive, massive paws, that certainly suggested this was a bear. And in a way, this was sort of reassuring for Smith, because ultimately he was going out here to confirm that this was a bear, right? This wasn't anything else, this was a bear. But as he's looking at these tracks and watching them sort of meander their way through this clearing and, back off into the woods, he noticed something strange about these tracks. Yes, they were paw prints that certainly suggested they were a bear. But the way they were landing in the ground suggested it was just 2 paws, not 4. And a bear walks on all 4. Whatever creature was leaving behind these prints was walking on 2 legs. Bears don't do that. And so Smith couldn't help but feel like a little unnerved. I mean, he's seeing clear as day prints of a bipedal creature with huge paws, huge claws, walking around near their campsite. I mean, what did this? Is this a bear? He knew bears could get up on their hind legs, but they don't walk very far on just their hind legs. And so this was unsettling. And again, as much as he wasn't scared of, the curse or monsters that were out here, it was hard not to think, like, is there truth to that stuff? And so Smith, sort of rattled, he turns around and hustles back to the campsite, and he tells Bauman, I found tracks, and I think it's bear tracks. But whatever it is walking around on 2 legs. Like, I'm telling you, it's 2 legs. There's no 4-legged creature walking around. And Bauman laughed. He actually thought that Smith was just like playing a joke on him, like, you're trying to scare me out here, right? But Smith is like, I'm not joking. Like, I'm telling you, the tracks 100% are of an animal walking around on 2 legs. And it appears to be an enormous bear, And, Bauman at this point, he's like, well, bears can walk on their hind legs, but both of them are like, yeah, but again, not for long periods of time. And so the 2 men really didn't know what to make of this. I mean, by this point, their campsite was set back up, they had their fire, their things are sort of back to normal, and they're not hearing any animals or anything odd in the vicinity. And so pretty quickly, they both were like, well, I guess that was just a standing bear. Hopefully it doesn't come back. And they just sat down by the fire and ate their dinner. So after dinner, the 2 men eventually did decide to just go to sleep. They were sort of in denial about the weirdness that was going on at their campsite, but they had both sort of, without saying anything, elected to just not talk about it and just bury those feelings and just ignore this gut instinct, this almost primal instinct that something was off here. And so the 2 men, they climbed into their lean-to tent together and they lied down next to each other, and eventually they drifted off to sleep. Several hours later, when Smith and Bauman were both fast asleep inside of this lean-to right next to each other, there was this loud, almost moaning sound coming from somewhere in the forest. And it was loud enough that it woke both Smith and Bauman up. And so they sit up inside of their lean-to. It's dark, but they can basically see each other. And they're sort of saying to each other, like, hey, did you hear that? Like, what was that? Neither of them knew, but now they're sort of on edge. And they're sitting in their lean-to, obviously thinking about the fact that, this bear or whatever it was had clearly come through here the day before. They're hoping it's not coming back. And they're sitting there listening really intently to the noises coming from the forest. And there are regular night noises, all across the forest, bugs and birds and animals, that kind of thing. But as they're straining to listen, they can hear something huge is making its way through the tree line in their direction. And so Bauman sort of reflexively grabbed his rifle and, he's just holding onto his rifle, wondering what he's gonna do. And Smith too is sort of not sure what to do. And then at some point, as whatever this is got close enough to their lean-to, they can't see it. They're too scared to poke their head out to look, but they know it's getting closer. When it got close enough, they began to smell whatever it was. It was like this musty earth smell. And as the 2 men are like getting ready to actually make a plan about what to do, like obviously this thing is back, whatever it is, They hear the noise again that woke them up, but now it's literally coming from right outside of their lean-to. And it's this guttural, loud, almost like human moaning sound, but it's definitely not a person. It's just this eerie, low rumbling sound, and it's right outside the tent. And Bauman, as soon as he heard this, he just turned and he aimed his rifle and fired basically roughly in the direction of where this thing was, which again is right outside their lean-to. And as soon as he fired, both men heard the sound of this huge creature right outside their lean-to turn and start running into the forest, just bounding through the trees. Trees are crashing. It's this totally chaotic sound as this huge thing is retreating into the woods. And then at some point, all the noise stops and they don't hear it again. And the two men are like so frightened by whatever this was. It certainly didn't feel like a bear. They had not smelled something like that. They had certainly not heard a sound like that. And just the way it was moving, it was so agile and so huge and did sound like something that was walking sort of upright. Like even just the steps it was taking right outside their lean-to, it didn't sound like a typical animal moving around. This was different. And so the two men, they're terrified and they're just up all night, waiting for this thing to come back. By the time the sun finally rose the next morning, Smith was so anxious and so exhausted that he actually felt sick. He didn't want to leave the campsite because this trip was ultimately about making money and they had not caught any beavers yet, so this was not a profitable trip yet. But if they left now, they definitely wouldn't be catching anything, and this really would be a net loss. However, both he and Bauman both agreed that, whatever kind of creature here kept coming back to their campsite, it certainly did not act, walk, or sound like a bear. Whatever it was, clearly it was dangerous. So ultimately, what Bauman and Smith decide to do is they are going to basically wrap up this trip early, but first, they're going to go check all those beaver traps they had set, both around the pond and up the hill next to that stream. But normally they would do this together, and it would take a really long time to go to each and every trap and check it, and if there was a beaver in there to work through that. So what they decided to do instead, in order to be expeditious and be really quick, is they would split up. It's broad daylight. They figured they were safe here from whatever this creature was, and they would split up, they would divide and conquer, check all the traps, and then meet back at the campsite before it was dark, pack up, and leave. A little while later, Bauman had finished checking all the traps that he was responsible for, and he had come back with 3 beavers over his shoulder, and he was feeling pretty good. He was pretty quick checking his traps. He's thinking, great, our plan's gonna work. I bet Smith is done too. We can pack up and get out of here, hopefully really soon. And so he's walking towards the campsite and he can see it up ahead. And at first glance, everything looked to be in normal order. The lean-to was still set up and he could see there was some gear stacked up on the ground. And so as Bauman got closer to the camp, he began calling out to his friend, to Smith. And Smith didn't call back. Now, Bauman didn't really know if Smith was actually back to the campsite yet. He could still be out checking his traps. So Bauman, he walks into the campsite and Smith is not there. But that gear that he saw from a distance sort of stacked up in the middle of the campsite, well, it was Smith's gear, and he had packed it all up and stacked it there, which certainly suggested that Smith had finished checking his traps, had packed his stuff, and had to be nearby, like he was getting ready to leave too. And so Bauman's thinking, okay, I just gotta find him. Maybe he walked off somewhere as he's waiting for me. And so Bauman, he puts his beavers down and continues calling out for Smith, just sort of wandering around, the rough vicinity of the campsite, hoping to find Smith. But Smith never calls back. And Bauman's getting a little worried. Again, they're obviously on edge here. Some weird things have been happening here. That creature obviously totally freaked them out. And so, Bauman is yelling louder and louder, and he's sort of moving faster and faster, trying to find some sign of where Smith went. And at some point, Bauman makes his way into that clearing where the night before, Smith had actually found those tracks that showed, this bipedal creature moving around. And when Bauman made his way into that clearing, he just stopped. Because the first thing he saw is there was blood all over this clearing. It was like a bloodbath everywhere. And then on the other side of the clearing, sort of draped up against this tree, was like this heap of meat. That heap of meat was Smith. Smith had been absolutely ripped to shreds. Like his body was just destroyed. His limbs were all in different directions. Like he was ripped to pieces. And I mean, Bauman, he didn't even have to go over to check to see if he was dead. He was definitely dead. There's no creature in the area. It's totally silent, eerily silent. And Bauman, like, he's just staring at his friend, wondering, like, what does he even do? But as he's standing there staring at this just horrific scene, something else clicked. If it had been an animal that attacked his friend Smith, if an animal was responsible for this, it likely would have eaten Smith, or there would have been signs that Smith was eaten by this animal. But Smith had no signs of predation. Smith had no signs that an animal was trying to eat him. His whole body was just ripped apart, like whatever killed him just wanted to kill him and basically fling him around like a toy as he was being killed. And so at this point, almost like instinctively, Bauman knew two things. One, the creature clearly killed Smith. There was no other explanation that made sense here. He didn't understand, why or even how, but the creature had to have done this. And two, the creature was not a bear. Couldn't have been a bear. There's too many obvious signs that what they're dealing with here is not a bear or really any animal he had ever run into. And then also, sort of a third thing was, Bauman's thinking, I wasn't that far away. Like this horrifically violent attack, it sort of happened silently or just fast enough that, Smith didn't have time to scream. It's like this creature killed almost surgically, despite the sort of gratuitous nature of the scene. And so all that said to Bauman is he needed to leave right now. And so he literally left his friend, he left all the supplies, he just turned and fled. Over the next several decades, Bauman just lied about what happened to Smith. He told people that while they were out there, Smith was attacked and killed by a bear. And the reason he did that and did not tell people that, well, it was some bipedal monster that, wandered the woods and slaughtered my friend, the reason he didn't say that is because he felt like nobody would believe him, that he would look crazy. And that, of course, like he's feeding into this rumor that this particular area is cursed and there's a monster out there. He just didn't think people would take him seriously, so he kept it to himself. That was until about 40 years later when Bauman met this man that he felt like he could trust with his real story. This man was an avid hunter, and he was collecting unique stories for a book he was writing about wilderness exploration. And to Bauman, it felt like his story was a fit. So Bauman told him the truth. He told him all about, what they experienced out there and, the fact that he did not believe it was a bear. He felt like it was a monster, if you will. And this man who's hearing this story took Bauman really seriously. He took detailed notes as Bauman was recounting this, horrific thing, and then he ultimately published Bauman's account in his book. In the book, the writer described this creature that Bauman and Smith encountered in the woods as, quote, something either half human or half devil, some great goblin beast. Now, to modern audiences, when you hear the details of the story, the one I've just shared with you, I mean, the monster really sounds an awful lot like Bigfoot, or at least something Bigfoot adjacent. But the writer published this book, published Bauman's account, in 1893, which was more than 60 years before the term Bigfoot even existed. So today, Bigfoot believers cite this book, in particular Bauman's experience, as one of the very first documented accounts ever of a monster that is now ubiquitous. But the writer of this book did not go down in history as, being remembered for documenting Bigfoot essentially for the first time, or at least before anybody knew, what Bigfoot was. No. Instead, the writer would go down in history for what he did 8 years after publishing that book. That was when he was elected as America's 26th president. The writer was Theodore Roosevelt. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, See ya.